link below. And in exchange, and everything, not everything is free. In exchange, support us with regards to Disease X. We are still #1 bestseller in microbiology science. Disease X, Are You Prepared? Support us. Buy this book. It has so much valuable information in it, and it's in an easy to read format. It's just been put out on Amazon. We've worked hard for this, and so we really would appreciate your support. And critically, when you do read it, please share the reviews. Now, as I was saying, Embalmers Clots. This sounds like a conspiracy, but you wouldn't realize how real this is. And so, to make sure that this was such an important topic, what I did is I reached out to Richard Hirschman, who I'd interviewed initially, along with Tom Haviland, to clarify whether or not this was still happening. And here was his response. He says that overall, it seems like there's a slight decrease in the clots, but that's only his observation. He pointed out that another embalmer was still seeing a lot of them. And he was saying he took another sample and he stained it for thioflavin T on Tuesday, which was looking for amyloid. And they are finding amyloid in these clots. And then he says, what are the odds for me to take 2 samples from 2 separate individuals, one female and one male and one female, one elderly and the other in the mid 50 to 55, one in the artery and the other one from the vein. Both of these clots, abnormal clots, are amyloid, which is supposedly rare. So this is what is happening. And this, remember, this is a comment just from a few days ago. I got this point. So this is still happening. And I was really struggling to try and come up with what I thought was a sensible comparison. And so this is my explanation as to what I think this is comparable to. Let us just imagine that barbers cutting men's hair are finding that they are seeing relatively large flat moles in the scalp when they try and cut their hair, which is damaging the scalp when they try and cut it, so people bleed. It's interfering with the process of them making the hair look neat, and they'd never seen it before. So these barbers say, we're not happy about this. They report it to the medical and scientific fraternity, and they just ignore it. Yet cases of melanoma are increasing. People are dying in unusual fashions, and nobody's interested. That's effectively what is happening here, because let me explain something very important. What the embalmers are seeing, and I've got an image here just to try and give you an idea as to what it is that embalmers do. You have to understand the science of it. What an embalmer does is that in order to preserve a body, they have to get rid of blood. And so therefore they empty the body of blood and replace it with a special embalming fluid. And they have a machine that does this or helps to do this. And so the embalmers do this process. And I'm going to show you just an image to help you to understand what it is that they're talking about here. So they have an embalming pump. They probably put a catheter in the groin in one of the big arteries or the veins, and they have another catheter up at the neck. And then they pump the fluid through. And as the fluid is being pumped through, it's emptying the body of blood. And so they will get clots and blood coming out in this procedure. The point is that since about 2021, they noticed a significant increase in very unusual white fibrous clots. And this was affecting their work because it was blocking the pump. And so it made it take longer to do the procedure. Now, would you think that this abnormal change, which only an embalmer can notice, this is an important point. A pathologist doing an autopsy will not notice this because they are not pumping the blood out. This is something that is unique to their area of work. They are noticing a change, and nobody is interested in clarifying what that change is. This is now almost 4 years, and it's unbelievable that that could happen. And so I've continued to look at the research and come up with ideas. And what I'm going to share with you here is just a little bit about the science. And I'm going to be showing you here a paper that has come out in 2024 about vascular long COVID, a new vessel disease. This is important because it's talking about the fact that they are linking this to long COVID, but long COVID is now becoming almost too broad a word. And in effect, they're talking about what I think is described as a COVID storm, where when people get reinfected with this virus, if their immune system has been primed, they end up with an endotheliitis, which I'll explain in a minute. But this is the point. This is pretty serious stuff because, as I said, I realize that what has happened is that people are putting things in one basket or the other. They'll say it's either only COVID or they'll say it's either only the elephant in the room. I say it's the both. It's both. It's a combination. It's when the two come together, you then get a pretty serious situation. I took this far more seriously. And again, the link is in the description. So if you haven't seen this, this is probably one of my highest watched videos on Substack. And I couldn't do this live because the censors would have been after me because they would say that it can't be true. So if you need to watch this, this is the full presentation of a whistleblower, an anonymous whistleblower in a cath lab, who then confirmed that this wasn't just happening with embalmers, it was happening in the living. And so if you want to watch this, it has all the images of the clots, some pretty heavyweight stuff. So if you can't look at clots, don't watch this because you'll be able to see all of that. So if you want to be able to understand what they were seeing in the living, look at the description below. That's the kind of thing that we should be able to talk about publicly, but we can't because it has too many potential ramifications, and this is possibly why it is not being addressed. So I'm just going to show you a few important principles with regards to these embalmers clots and why I think that they are occurring. And you have to understand a few things about clots is that this is an example of a clot, just a normal blood clot. The purpose of a clot is to prevent blood leaking out of the bloodstream. So anywhere there is damage or a hole, or if there is damage, the body automatically thinks there's a hole that blood can leak out. And then it forms this meshwork, which is a combination of platelets and red blood cells and fibrin. And then they block and plug these clots. That's why you don't bleed to death. And it's very tightly balanced because if the blood starts to clot too much, it will block up the whole blood vessel and cause people to die. If it doesn't block enough, you will continue to bleed and you will lose blood. So, this is a really important aspect of the whole process that the body does. And what you have to remember as well is that this lining, the endothelial cells, are very, very smoothly connected. So if you were to go inside a blood vessel, it would be smoother than glass. So it's really smooth. So any kind of damage will cause these blood vessels to block up because that's just what they do. Now, in order to understand what I'm going to be showing you next in terms of the research, you have to understand a little bit more about blood vessels generally. And I'm just going to show you a big vein, which is going to be similar to what happens in a big artery. And here you have, this is an example. And remember the lining, the endothelial lining here, very smooth. Underneath it, they have some muscle. And then beneath that, they have the what they call the tunica externa, which has arteries and veins in there supplying all of this tissue. And it's what we call the vasovassorum. It's the same in arteries. I'm just showing you one of the big veins here that this occurs in. And so if this gets inflamed, then it will cause damage to the lining and therefore potentially lead to clot formation on the inside of the artery or the vein. So it's very, very important, these vasovassorum. And what we're realizing is that they're getting caught up in the inflammatory cascade around COVID and in terms of the elephant in the room. And as I said, it's a combination of both of these things that really is driving the problem. So let's look quickly at this paper, just so that you understand this is the science. It's just how you interpret the science that will determine what you see. In the paper, they were focused on long COVID. I am focused on the COVID storm and trying to see whether or not the COVID storm is actually occurring or still driving some of these changes. So here we have this paper here, vascular long COVID, a new vessel disease. And in this paper, I've just highlighted a few areas because they're noticing that this pattern happens about 12 weeks after the original infection. This is the long COVID picture. And this group from Italy was then looking at some of the patterns, especially around clotting and the cytokines. But remember what I said about the lining, the endothelial lining that is there is normally very smooth, and anything that damages this lining will lead to clots. And so they found that the main pathophysiological observations that can be detected in small and medium sized arteries is initially characterized by an endotheliitis evolving into a hypersensitive acute vasculitis. Now, this is where it links to that autoimmune process. And in effect, there are two things that are likely to be happening. One, autoantibodies are damaging the lining of these blood vessels because they have ACE2, the same entry receptor as the virus, and the same thing that will bind to the elephant in the room, ACE2. And additionally, not just antibodies, but the military style CD8 lymphocytes. These are lethal, almost what you'd call a marine or seal white blood cells that just go in and destroy any cell that has any remnant of the virus, or if they have been primed, they will target even the lining cells that have ACE2. And this is probably what is likely to be happening. And because of this inflammatory process, they are noticing that the spike protein, they are saying from the infection, I say from any source, provokes the activation of inflammatory pathways that promotes micro and macrovascular endothelial dysfunction and damage. And so this is what is happening inside the blood vessels that is causing this inflammation. And just so that you remember what it looks like, this is the lining, the endothelial lining. The blood is on the inside here. This needs to be very smooth in order for clots not to form, but you're getting inflammation not just on the surface here, but inside the lining of the blood vessel, which is then causing this to become damaged and inflamed and therefore causing clots to form. And it is this pattern that seems to be occurring that is driving these abnormal clots. Now, importantly, I still am not convinced that this is occurring in normal people. We're seeing microclots. So if you're not sick, I don't think this will be happening. That's the reassurance. You have to be pretty sick for this to occur. And when I did my presentation, I predicted that it was a number of things that had to occur together, not just the fact that you have autoimmunity to ACE2, but also that it triggers off a platelet targeting of autoantibodies as well. And the whole combination together drives these very abnormal big clots. And the reason why I think embalmers are seeing them is because when people get these kinds of clots, very often they may die if they're not urgently treated. And this is what the whistleblower who was working in a cath lab was finding. These were emergency cases they were dealing with, and they were finding these big clots, these clots going to the lung, clots going to the brain. And that's the point, is that they either end up with these very big clots that need urgent intervention, or they die and they end up being an embalmer clot. So in the normal person, I don't think this is happening. And when you look at angiograms, because these clots are too big to be hidden with an angiogram, and so therefore it suggests it's a relatively acute process that is occurring that's driving all of this to happen. And just a few more points with regards to the paper that I've highlighted here is that they confirm that this dysregulated activation of the immune system, which entails an overproduction of immune inflammatory cells leading to the endotheliitis, that's the inflammation of the blood vessel lining. Then there's a hyperproduction of platelets, which even in the pulmonary, this is the lung tissue, triggers microcirculatory hypercoagulation. That means the blood gets very thick and starts to clot. And this whole process is what is driving many of these things. And when they looked at the histology, they were finding that wherever you see all these little black dots, these are immune cells that have infiltrated the tissue. So this is a pretty significant autoimmune process, which is what we said from the beginning. This is all about autoimmunity, how the immune system is getting overwhelmed on exposure to spike protein. If we don't get this principle, none of this was going to make sense. And I suspect it's because there is a failure to acknowledge this autoimmune process within the scientific community. Because if you acknowledge it, it then becomes very obvious that you will have abnormal clotting, because that's what happens very often in autoimmune disease. And so, here, in terms of the final point here, it says in this hypercoagulant, that means increased clotting, both these factors directly lead to thrombosis, mainly venous, that means the veins, but also arterial. And that fits with what we saw when we looked at what the whistleblower was showing, is that he was demonstrating, and if you're squeamish, don't look at this, but he was demonstrating here, these are some massive clots taken out of people. In this is the inferior vena cava. It's surprising they survived this. They could only survive this if they had an emergency procedure to remove this kind of clot. And so this is what seems to be happening. And because we are, I should say, not we, because the scientific community is failing to acknowledge what is being observed by people who are doing a very unique procedure. They're almost ignoring them because, as far as they're concerned, they're not doctors, they're not scientists, so therefore, how could they observe something? That's just ridiculous, because they are the only ones who can see something. And if they are seeing something abnormal, we're the same ones who would be saying, you need to make sure that you share this, you tell people about it, because it's relevant. The only reason this is being ignored now is because those people in power are afraid that it could be linked to an elephant in the room. That's the only reason. That's the only thing that makes any sense, because under any other circumstance, we would be encouraging embalmers to tell us about this happening, finding out the characteristics. Because here is what I would want to know. I would want to know the clinical presentation of the patients who were having these abnormal clots. I'd want to know, how did they present? What were their symptoms? How did they die? What did they die of? Was it sudden? Was it expected? Was it? There's so many pieces of information that would help us from a clinical point of view to be able to make sense of the situation. But the fact that it is being ignored is not in anyone's interest. So hopefully this is important enough. As I said, all the links are below, and most critically, the link to support us, Disease X, Are You Prepared? Great book, telling everything in a story fashion, helping you to understand all of the things that happened around the pandemic from a scientific point of view. And this is available on Amazon for you to read. And please support us in this process, as we are still number one bestseller here in microbiology science. So we're holding up, and all we need now are your reviews. So please continue to support us. Thank you very much for listening. And as I mentioned before, the Embalmers Clot whole 1 hour presentation is available for your Christmas gift for free. So if you're interested in learning about my thoughts on it and some of the science, please, as usual, click on the link below. Have a great evening. We'll keep you updated.